Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. My name is Kim Bryan, and I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer here at the Sixth Floor Museum. And I'm delighted to introduce our two special guests, Thomas Mallon and Michael Granberry. Thomas Mallon is the author of Mrs. Payne's Garage, and Michael Granberry, of course, is one of our favorite journalists from the Dallas Morning News. We're so pleased that they could be here tonight to talk about this exciting story and the wonderful book that has been written and updated. So with that, I'll turn it over to you both. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you. Well, it is my pleasure to do this because one of the stories that I've enjoyed the most, and I just looked it up before we started, back in 2002, Tom, I interviewed you about Mrs. Payne's Garage. And for me, it was an extraordinary experience, not just reading the book, but talking with you about it and learning more about you and how you work. And I wanted to ask you a question right off the bat that I find so interesting about the book, and it's something you said the first time we met. I basically asked you, why Ruth Paine? And you said that you like to pick these people who are kind of on the periphery, that you have done this before in your career. Another example was your book, Henry and Clara. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was learning from a great teacher that day, because not only have I used that in my journalism career, but I have a book coming out next year. And I think there's like 3 or 4 kind of explosive things in the book, but they were all given to us by people on the periphery, right?
Yeah.
But let me ask you that. Why, for the purposes of this exchange, why Ruth Paine, and why is it intriguing to you to focus on someone who's on the periphery as a way of telling the story?
Well, I was 12 at the time of the assassination, and I'd been very caught up in the Kennedy years as a kid, even before the assassination. In the New Yorker, I did a sort of longish piece on what would have been President Kennedy's 100th birthday in 2017. And one of the things I did was I found the letter I wrote to him when I was 10 years old in the Kennedy Library, protesting the Supreme Court decision that put an end to prayer in public schools. And as a good Catholic boy on Long Island, we'd been sort of trained to think that that was the wrong decision. But in any event, I was also from very early on an avid newspaper reader. And I remember the first time I read about Ruth Paine, my father's paper, the paper he brought home every night, was the New York World Telegram, which was an old broadsheet, long since defunct, in New York. And I found the article a couple of days after the assassination. Somebody did a feature article called Mrs. Oswald's Pal Beset. And it was the story of how difficult things were for Ruth Paine, the woman who had really had Marina living with her in the months prior to the assassination, and had Oswald living there or staying there on the weekends. And so from very early on, and I was an avid sort of student of the assassination from the beginning, Mrs. Payne was a figure I was aware of. And then in terms of my own writing life as an adult, the first real article I ever read, I started out as a literature PhD. I used to do scholarship, and I taught literature for quite a number of years at Vassar. And I wrote an article while I was still a graduate student called A Boy of No Importance. And it was a play on the title A Woman of No Importance, the Oscar Wilde play. And it was the story of a young man named Edward Shelley, who was the office boy in Wilde's publisher's house. And he had gotten involved with Wilde and had to testify against him at the trial. It was very different from the other run of, boy prostitutes and so forth who testified against Wilde in 1895. He was this very striving, respectable, somewhat literary, eager to be getting on kind of young man. And he just sort of came and went in the books about Wilde and the biographies, and I wondered whatever happened to him. And I found letters, or somebody got me started by giving me letters that Shelley had written to his boss. I went over to England. I found out that he'd lived until 1951, that he had become one of the Grenadier Guards after the trial, kind of enlisted, sort of overcompensation and masculinity, had been in the Boer War, and but was clearly, his life in many ways had been governed by this experience that he had had with Oscar Wilde. And in some ways, this became a template for me, both in nonfiction that I wrote, as well as in fiction. You mentioned Henry and Clara was the book I had written. It was published in 1994, which was the story of Henry Rathbone and his then fiancée, Clara Harris, who shared the balcony at Ford's Theater with the Lincolns on the night of the assassination. And the astonishing things that had happened to them, partly as a result of their having been caught up in that night. And that was a novel. And it was after that that the idea of writing about Ruth Paine occurred to me. But from the beginning, I wanted, because I saw her in some ways as an analogous figure, somebody who had been swept up in this, and I wanted to know what it had done to her life. And I wrote her at the time, really within a year, I think, of Henry and Clara coming out, and she was very reluctant to do this. And she knew I was a novelist, and I think that I don't think that was appealing to her, because even though from the beginning I said, no, this is going to be nonfiction. And Ruth kept wondering, why me? Why am I interesting? Ruth was somebody who had done her very best over the years to tell the truth as she remembered it to the Warren Commission. Her testimony in the Warren Commission takes up more pages of the 26 volumes of appendices than anybody else's does.
Wow.
She knew more about Lee and Marina Oswald's movements and moods in the months prior to the assassination than anybody else. But she said, you know, why me? I have information that I imparted, and I've been willing to, over the years, talk to people who were writing books about the assassination, but you clearly want to write about how it affected my life. And I said, yes, that's exactly what I want to write about. And she always insisted that it had influenced her life, but not governed it. And but she was very reluctant to do it. We kept in touch for about 4 years. And then she said in 1999, she was willing to go through the long series of interviews I wanted to put her through.
So the negotiation lasted about 4 years before you actually started writing the book? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a negotiation. She turned me down, and I understood it, and she did it in a very polite, reasoned way. But she didn't resist, and even seemed happy enough to keep in touch. I saw her a couple of times when I was down, I think a couple of times in Florida, at least once, when I was on a book tour or something. I saw her in New York. And, you know, we exchanged Christmas cards and occasional notes. And I mean, I've thought over the years, you'd have to ask Ruth herself. Ruth is alive in Santa Rosa, California. I often wondered if maybe she was keeping the door open, you know, to possibly changing her mind, you know, as time went on. And in 1999, she called me up. I remember it was a Sunday afternoon, and it was very shortly after John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane had gone down. And I think that in some ways, this was one more thing that churned this all up in her. We were getting close to 40 years after the assassination at that point. But I mean, you know, she was a young woman at the time of the assassination, 2-3 years younger than Jacqueline Kennedy. She had two small children, a small girl, a small boy. There were commonalities in a way, and people did often project themselves onto the Kennedys partly because of their youth when they were in the White House. And something, I don't know if it was a direct connection, but I think something unleashed or loosened something in her. And there was a local writer who was asking about her story, and I had said, look, Ruth, if you put yourself through this, because she knew, Ruth is a sophisticated woman, and she knew that this was going to be kind of an ordeal for herself. And I said, if you do it, do it right. I said, I know that I can get the New Yorker to be interested in this piece, and about a quarter of this book, which I promised the publisher I would have sitting next to me, about a quarter of it appeared in the New Yorker in very late 2001. And then the rest of it was reserved for the book. And so she agreed to do it. And once she did, Ruth was in many respects an ideal subject, in that, you think somebody who was skittish about doing it might be the kind of person who, you know this better than I do, as a journalist, your fear is that they're going to say every 10 minutes, oh, you got to turn off the tape recorder, I want to go off the record with this, whatever. Right. Ruth really was not like that. Right. Once she was in, she sort of let me proceed as a writer. So, but that's really that's a very long answer to how this all got started.
One of the things also that fascinated me the first time we met was I asked you, I think I actually asked you this toward the end of the interview, what, if anything, is the theme of the book? And you said, without hesitating, no good deed goes unpunished. Can you elaborate on that? To me, that's fascinating. And when you take on the totality of Ruth's story, this the ghastly thing that happened to her, I keep coming back to that expression. Can you elaborate on that and how she embodies that theme?
Yes, I mean, Ruth was, still is, a very serious Quaker. She was not raised as a Quaker, but she embraced the Society of Friends very seriously as a young woman, late 1940s, early 1950s. She and really had tried always to lead an ethical life, to do good to others. And, I'm very fond of Ruth, and I have enormous respect for her. In some ways, I would say I've never been totally relaxed around Ruth, because I don't think of myself as a bad person, but I'm not a person who strives each day to see whether my personal behavior and personal decisions fit in with, a kind of program of doing good in the world, or even, more locally. And that interested me enormously. And, there are all these fantastical conspiracy theories involving Ruth, as there are with almost every aspect of the Kennedy assassination. And people who say, oh, she was Oswald's CIA minder, or this, that, or the other thing. And in fact, what people have a hard time accepting, just as they have a hard time accepting coincidence about anything, is they have a hard time accepting that somebody would disinterestedly do good for somebody else. And she met Oswald 9 months to the day before the assassination. She was living in Irving. At the time, her house is now a museum, the Ruth Paine house in Irving. And she was invited by a man she sang madrigals with. I mean, the Paines were very unusual people for Irving. I mean, her husband from whom she was separated, Michael Paine, was the great-great-grandson of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he had come down to work at Bell Helicopter, and they moved to Irving in, I think, 1959. And so, you know, they did things like folk dancing and madrigal singing and whatever, and their politics were certainly to the left of the average Irvingite in those days. But Everett Glover, the man who was in this group, asked her if she'd like to come to a party, because there was going to be a fellow who had recently been in the Soviet Union, who was going to be at this party. And how Oswald knew Everett Glover is a complicated story, but sort of peripheral to Ruth's story. And Ruth was interested, mostly because this young man, she was not told that he had been a defector in the Soviet Union, but Ruth was interested mostly in the fact, when she got to the party, that he had a Russian wife, Marina, who was 10 years younger than Ruth. Marina was really only in her early 20s at that point. And it was a chance for Ruth to speak Russian, which she had been trying to learn in any number of ways throughout the 50s. I think she'd taken some Berlitz classes. She'd studied at Middlebury College in the language program. And this was a chance to speak Russian. She really was not interested that much in Oswald himself. It was Marina. And they became friends. And Ruth provided them with all kinds of assistance over the next 9 months. And chiefly in the fall of that year, when Marina was living with Ruth, Oswald was living downtown in a rooming house, and he would come out on the weekends to the house. He didn't drive. Ruth unsuccessfully tried to teach him to drive. So it was easier for him to get his job at the book depository, which was a job that in some ways he owed to Ruth. Ruth had heard from a neighbor down the street, Linnie Mae Randall, that they were hiring at the book depository where Wesley Frazier worked, and her brother. And you know all these people, Mike. You've kept these people alive, really, with all of the feature articles you've done over the years, kept them alive in people's minds and memories. And so that led to Oswald's being hired. And the things that interested me, aside from Ruth herself and how this had upended her life, the things that interested me were what Graham Greene might call the human factors. Small twists of fate, small coincidences, small ironies, things that seem odd, but are only explicable if you assume that there are mysteries in life. You know, one of the reasons Oswald got hired at the book depository was the manager, Mr. Truly, interviewed him, and he later said, "Well, he called me sir. A lot of the boys don't do that these days."
Oh.
And, you know, and Oswald, who was very sullen and argumentative in lots of ways, but he was also a Southern boy, you know, born in New Orleans and so forth. And he knew how to sir people. And that was something that interested me. And those were the things I wanted to talk to Ruth about. I wanted to talk to her about how she related to him as a person. She didn't like him. And she struggled with that because Ruth, her ethical compass, I think, if she doesn't like somebody, she feels that, well, she has to make an extra effort to understand them. You know, what's the basis of the dislike, and how can that dislike be overcome, even if it's the other person's fault? And I think that she would give Oswald the benefit of the doubt, and she would struggle to keep a peaceful relationship with him, partly because she knew that Marina needed her help. So it was those kinds of things. That's what the book is about her relationship with the two of them, more with Marina than with him. And then a lot of the rest of the book is about what might be called the culture of the Kennedy assassination, the way in which in the late 90s, I think belief in conspiracy was reaching a sort of high water mark after the Oliver Stone movie, and with the advent of the web, where everything is literally linked. And so these Kennedy assassination news groups would flourish, and there would be constant chatter, constant exchange of information, theories. And so a lot of that, which I think to some degree has subsided over the years, but a lot of that kind of went into the book as well.
I want to go back and ask you a little bit more about the Ruth-Marina relationship. But before we go there, I do want to ask you about conspiracy. And, you know, I have this theory of my own, where we are awash in conspiracy theories these days, you know, whether it's about vaccinations or you know, the previous president says there was a conspiracy to deny him the election. I mean, we are just smothering in conspiracy theories. My own theory, like if you were examining, you know, the reality of conspiracy, the way that a psychiatrist would examine a patient, maybe you would go back to the Kennedy assassination and the fact that Jack Ruby deprived us of the trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, which might have eliminated the birth of the conspiracy movement, right? What do you think about that? And to what extent, elaborate a little bit more on how Ruth fits into the fabric of conspiracy.
Well, I think because Ruth was such an unusual figure
Right,
for
right.
Irving,
Yeah.
and you know, there were family connections to intelligence agencies and things like that. I think that there were people who were eager to pounce on her. Oswald's brother, Robert, who in many ways I think was quite an admirable figure, had to live with that horrible curse on his family for all of those years. Robert, from the moment he met Ruth and Michael Paine, was wary of them. They were not his kind of people. He didn't kind of get them, and so I think it was those kinds of things that put Ruth into this very difficult position. But I think that if you read her testimony in the Warren report, you realize the scrupulous nature of it, the degree to which she is going the extra mile at every point to remember things clearly, to tell the truth, and so forth. And but the fact that we never had an actual judicial proceeding, an actual trial because of Jack Ruby, I think that put her in, over time, it would have been a difficult position to be in any case. She would have had to testify at the trial just as she did at the commission. But I think over time, it would have put her in a less difficult position, because I think her truthfulness would have been more demonstrable. It would have been more evident to people. But the conspiracy belief, which really used to be, I mean, I think you're absolutely right now. We have conspiracies about absolutely everything now. But the Kennedy assassination sort of stood out, you know, and people would talk about things like a grassy knoll mentality to indicate somebody who was bent on conspiracy explanations of things. It really did stand out for a while. And I think it was because how could this malcontent with a $14 rifle change the history of the world? And I think it just seemed quite unbelievable to people. And it's not that there aren't questions to be asked about the assassination. I mean, there are many respectable, skeptical writers who have dealt with it. Lyndon Johnson himself said, about Oswald, he was a mighty mysterious fellow.
Mhm.
And he had a very unusual life. For somebody who was 24 years old, had
Right.
been in the Marines, been a defector to the Soviet Union, nearly succeeded in killing General Walker, the right-wing general in Dallas in the
Mhm.
spring of '63. I mean, there are definitely questions to be asked, but investigation after investigation after investigation, and scholar after scholar after scholar, and book after book after book has tried to wrestle with those things. And I think what you've had is a great panoply of alternative explanations, but all those explanations contradict one another. The one meaning explanations other than the fact that Oswald did it and did it on his own. And and then these rogue figures like Jim Garrison, who threw absolutely everything against the wall, every theory he could think of.
Right.
And what I wanted to go back to were basic things. And when I talked with Ruth, we did these long interviews. She was living in St. Petersburg, Florida, in those days before she went to California. And I reconstructed with her, or got her to reconstruct for me, as moment by moment as she could, the night of November 21st, the night before the assassination.
Right.
And what the circumstances were. She drives up to the house in the afternoon. She's finished the errands, and she's startled to see Lee Oswald there.
Because it's a Thursday night, not a Friday night.
That's right. That's exactly right. He would come out only on Friday nights, and he always asked permission in advance. And she was startled to see him. She was not unfriendly. She was carrying groceries in, and she said in Russian to him, because number one, he didn't want Marina learning English. And Ruth's, part of the point of having Marina there, not just to help Marina out, was for Ruth to learn Russian. So they spoke Russian all the time. And Ruth would, try to convince Marina, no, you're, don't feel like you're somebody who's receiving charity from me. You're helping me. You're allowing me to learn Russian. But Ruth in Russian said to Oswald, our president is coming to town, meaning would be coming tomorrow. And he just kind of shrugged. But what he was really there to do was to pack up his rifle, which was in the garage. It had been there for some months. Ruth and Marina, when they had left New Orleans, where Oswald was in the summer, it's a very complicated odyssey, these 9 months, but it was in the back of the car, and it was wrapped up. Ruth didn't know that she was transporting this rifle, and it was in the garage wrapped up in a blanket. And he had gone to out to Irving to have the rifle and bring it to work the next day, because he knew the president's motorcade was going to pass under the building. And the detail that struck me the most when we sort of put together that evening of November 21st was after dinner. And this is after Oswald has been out to the garage to wrap the rifle in brown paper. And he left the light on, which Ruth discovered later. And, she just didn't think too much of it and just shut it. But that evening, after he had wrapped up the rifle, he made a special point of playing with Ruth's 2-year-old son, Chris. And I don't remember what they did. They kind of roughhoused on the carpet or something like that. And the reason that he did this, Marina would not tell this to Ruth directly. She wouldn't want to hurt her feelings, but it was something that Marina later told to the late Priscilla McMillan, who died just a couple of months ago. Ruth was probably aware of it on some level too, was that Oswald felt that Michael, Ruth's husband, from whom she was separated, really wasn't a very good father, wasn't paying enough attention to his children, and particularly that the little boy needed a man in his life, needed a masculine presence in his life. And so Oswald was very fond of Chris, who was very small, and he took a special interest and played with him that night. Well, you have to ask yourself, here you have this man who has come out to that house to get his rifle, and he's going to use it the following day to kill a man who is not only the president of the United States, but is the father of a 3-year-old boy.
Right, right.
And how do those things compute?
Right.
And I mean, the answer is they don't. And I think the reason they don't is not because Oswald was innocent, not because he didn't do it or was part of a larger conspiracy. I think you have to find the reasons for that in the mysteries of human nature. The same way anybody who has been to the 6th Floor Museum, our hosts for this event, and anybody who knows Dallas, knows that before the president's limousine was on Elm Street, it had to come down Houston Street toward the book depository.
Right.
And then it makes this hairpin turn onto Elm Street. It has to turn more than 90 degrees onto Elm Street. Why didn't Oswald shoot the president when the president's car was coming toward him? Why did he wait when he had only a matter of seconds to get off the shots when the limousine was going down Elm Street? And I have always believed, there's no way to prove it, but I've always believed that he was, while the car was coming down Houston, he was looking through the 4-power scope on his rifle, and he could not bear to shoot John F. Kennedy full in the face. Whereas once the car turned, it was almost more like an aerial bombing.
And even after the turn, he misses with the first shot.
Yeah. And I just think it was a less intimate act,
right,
to shoot him from behind than it would have been to shoot him when he was on Houston Street. And I think that in a sense, that some mercy, some tender mercy to wait. But in some ways, one has to remember that Oswald did have human feelings. He had human feelings the night before when he was playing with Chris Payne. And those things are going to be in contradiction with whatever his politics may have been and whatever the rest of his psychology, a much darker psychology may have been. So those were the kinds of things that interested me a lot when I was writing about Ruth.
Well, it's not unlike the stories you hear about serial killers. I remember covering, a horrible mass murder in San Diego in 1984, I think it was. This gunman killed 21 people in a McDonald's in San Diego. Most of them were children. And this woman who lived next door to him, shares this story about how, just a few days ago, he heard that my cat had died, and he brought me a rose, and he had a tear coming down his face. And these odd stories, about how an act of kindness shown by a serial killer. Although it was an incredibly hostile act to involve Ruth Paine in this thing at all, by keeping the murder weapon in her garage. I remember in 2002, Tom, in the interview and then in reading your book, that is such a moving story about when Ruth learned for the first time that murder weapon was being kept in her garage. Can you share that story with us of how she found that out?
Well, when the authorities came to the house after, Oswald was missing from the book depository, and they came to the house, and Ruth cooperated with them immediately. And the officer asks about a gun, and Marina says, yes, he has a gun, my husband. And this was news to Ruth.
Right.
And in fact, all throughout that fall on the weekends, Michael Payne in later years said he had seen the famous backyard photograph
Without telling Ruth.
the rifle. Yeah. And if that is the case, there would be 4 adults in that house on the weekend. Marina, Ruth, Michael, and Lee Oswald. And the only one who didn't know that there was a gun in the garage was the Quaker woman who would not have had it in the house, would not have allowed it in the house.
Right.
Marina was keeping a number of secrets from Ruth.
Oh, yeah.
Chiefly, what she did not tell Ruth was that Oswald had tried to kill General Walker, the segregationist general, back in the spring of '63. And in many ways, that was a crime that Oswald planned in much more detail. It was much less improvisational and last minute than his killing of the president was. But I don't have a doubt in my mind. I don't have any doubt in my mind that if Ruth had known about Oswald's taking a shot at General Walker, I don't have any doubt she would have gone to the police.
Right.
And I think this may be a line in the book, or it's just something I've said over the years, that somebody might have killed President Kennedy in Dallas that day. There was an awful lot of hostility to him of a very different kind from Oswald's political hostility, but it wouldn't have been Oswald. And so Ruth was a victim of secrets that were being kept from her. So when the officer goes into the garage and the blanket is picked up from the garage floor, the blanket that the rifle was typically kept in, the blanket just went limp over his arm. The rifle was not in it, clearly. And that at that point, that was news to Marina. I mean, Marina knew he had a gun, but Marina didn't know that he had taken the gun and used it that day. But once that limp blanket indicated that the gun was somewhere else, that was the moment, I think, that kind of cut Ruth's life in two.
Right.
I think that she knew that life was never really, going to be the same. And that was the point at which I really wanted. I think that was in some ways where the story became more difficult for her in terms of talking to me about it, because that was the point when my questions became, okay, how did you feel about that? What was your reaction to that? What was going on with you internally, whatever? And I wasn't asking, hard evidence, prosecutorial questions. I wanted her to talk to me about her feelings. And I remember I interviewed Michael, and I interviewed her daughter. And her daughter and Ruth, they had difficulties in their relationship over the years. And there were people who I think tried to make something out of that and so forth. And I remember interviewing her daughter, and she was telling me that and she had as a child trust issues with her mother. Now, if you say that to a conspiracy believer, they're immediately going to be off to the races, oh, why didn't she trust her mother, whatever. And she said it was because, no, she doesn't think, she doesn't buy into any of that conspiracy stuff, but she says, she was very young, she's about 4 years old. She says, I just remember there was this couple that were frequently there, and then suddenly they were gone, because Marina was gone very soon after anyway. And my mother, and the FBI was in and out of the house a lot. On Sunday, after Ruby killed Oswald, the FBI, I think they suggested, or the local police closed the curtains. They didn't know who might be next, if it was a conspiracy, who was going to be killed. And she says, my trust issues with my mother came from the fact that in the months after the assassination, my mother kept saying to me, oh, everything's all right. Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. Everything is fine. She was being a mother. She was trying to reassure her young daughter. And, with a child's perceptiveness, the little girl knew that everything manifestly was not fine. Something was wrong. Life was not normal. It was her mother saying that, don't worry, everything is fine. That's what troubled her and made her, less than totally confident in what her mother was telling her. And, but, Ruth, again, the strain that she would exhibit, the sense of obligation, the need to help people. I mean, Oswald on Saturday tried to enlist Ruth's help in getting a lawyer. I mean, talk about crust, I mean, the idea that this, man would be asking for her help after what he had put her through. But that's how his mind worked. And he did not believe in, he was very suspicious of people who were kind to other people. He would always imagine that they had to be working an angle because that's what his mother was like. I mean, Marguerite, who was a character straight out of Dickens. That's what she sort of instilled in him to a great extent. And so it was this group of very human, very different personalities. Michael, Marina, Marguerite Oswald, they were all extremely different. And to an extent, none of them was totally comfortable with the other in those months leading up to, and then certainly after the assassination.
Well, let's talk about one of them for a while. I'm really intrigued in the story about Ruth and in your book about the morality of Marina, for lack of a better phrase. As we know, well, first of all, she doesn't tell Ruth about the attempt to kill General Walker. She doesn't tell Ruth about the gun, the Kennedy murder weapon that's being stored in her garage. And then after the horrible event of the assassination, she basically drops Ruth from her life entirely. Can you elaborate a little bit on Marina and what her motivations were throughout this 9-month period that they knew each other?
Yes, I think a certain measure of understanding does need to be given to Marina, who was very, very young, in her early 20s, came to this country, spoke no English, is married to a man who beats her. That was another secret she kept from Ruth. I mean,
how
Ruth,
often did that happen? Was that a regular?
I don't know. The book I always recommend, I mentioned Priscilla McMillan, her book, Marina and Lee, which was written with Marina's cooperation, gives a very detailed picture of that marriage and really sort of incident by incident. You can follow that. But Ruth knew that they quarreled. I mean, she heard them quarrel, but she didn't know that Oswald beat Marina. Another thing, had she known it, I don't think she would have had him in the house. But Marina, in the weeks after the assassination, she's at the Six Flags Motel, essentially in the custody of the Secret Service. And does not really want anything to do with Ruth. And I think Marina had a tremendous sense of shame and embarrassment about things. And I think that when you have let down somebody, I mean, there was a whole host of reasons for Marina to feel embarrassed and ashamed. But when you're aware that you behaved badly towards somebody who was good to you,
Right.
I think it's, again, human nature. What you do in your head is you find reasons to feel hostile toward that person. You invent reasons to feel hostile to the person that you've let down, the person to whom you have not shown gratitude, whatever, because that makes it easier for you. It makes you, it allows you to unburden yourself of your own guilt. And I think that some of that happens. And the book, really the emotional relationship between the two women and the degree to which Marina really betrays Ruth, both before and after the assassination. A lot of the material in the book is about that. And I think that's kind of the emotional heart of the book. And Marina would not talk to me for this book. And they remain, at a remove of nearly 60 years, they remain estranged. And Marina has sort of done a 180 on the assassination over the years. At the very beginning, she believed that Oswald, or my crazy one, as she called him, she had no trouble believing that he had done it. But my understanding is that these days, she believes that Oswald had nothing to do with it at all. And just how she came to that conclusion is really for her to say, but
she's been very quiet for a long time, though.
Yes, and there were, I mean, this book of mine is 20 years old. I mean, the occasion for our conversation today is that it's been reissued,
Right.
a new paperback with sort of new notes, a new preface, things like that. But at the time, in the 90s, Marina was still working, I think, in an Army Navy store on McKinney in Dallas, and people would occasionally sort of kind of ambush her. Interviewers would sort of ambush her and try to talk to her. And I mean, I was not going to do that. And I would like to have talked to her, certainly, about it. But I think by the time I was writing this, she had already really cemented her views. And again, I think it's easier to live with that theory that Oswald didn't do this than it is to live with the opposite, just as it's easier for her to invent sort of reasons to resent Ruth rather than feel the guilt of ingratitude.
There's also the aspect that there's absolutely no money to be had in the lone gunman idea, right? I mean, the conspiracy camp is the only one that's willing to put up any money, right? In terms of trying to get you to. I mean, I say that only because she appeared on Oprah. I don't know that she was paid for that. I assume she may have been. That was quite some time ago, though. She wrote a piece for Ladies' Home Journal like ages ago. I assume she was paid for that as well. But let me.
During my interviews, with Ruth, the Oprah interview had already taken place, and I played it, an old video cassette of it for Ruth. We sort of watched it together, and she did sort of, she says something in it, Marina, about, when she's explaining her own situation in the fall of 1963, she's saying, well, she says over there, I was eating Quaker ladies' bread, meaning, depending on Ruth economically to some extent. And you think that maybe she's going to say something to kind of heal the breach, but it doesn't really happen. But she, at that point, she begins, at a certain point in the interview, she begins talking conspiratorially. And I remember Ruth saying to me as we watched the tape, I thought she was a better thinker than that.
Interesting.
Because she clearly felt that Marina had been sort of duped at some point.
Tom, let me ask you about this. As we know, those of us who have followed this story so closely for so long, Oswald comes to her house on Thursday night, and he is sharing the bed with Marina in the guest room, I guess, of Ruth's house. And there is this conversation between Marina and Lee, if you will. And it doesn't go well based on what he's asking for. What is your understanding of what was involved in that conversation, and what was the rejection that occurred? And might it have been different? Might history have been different if he had not been rejected by Marina in that conversation?
He was living in this rooming house in Oak Cliff, and he did not like the idea of his wife being dependent on Ruth Paine. And Ruth was very alert to the fact that he potentially could feel undermined, as we would have said 60 years ago, as a man, that his role as the breadwinner and as the husband might be being compromised by that. I think that bothered him. And he wanted to get back together with Marina, and yet he kept doing strange things. He had not been out the weekend just before, but they called him at the rooming house on, I believe it was Sunday or Monday night. I used to have these facts absolutely
Right.
in front of my mind, but the book is quite a while back now. And when they called the rooming house, they were told that there was no Lee Harvey Oswald living there because he was under an assumed name.
Right.
As he was O.H. Lee. And Marina was very upset by this because here he is, he has these fantasies, these aliases, another time he was Alex Heidel and all of the rest. And he lives this kind of fantasy life in his mind. And Oswald was very angry at Marina for calling. I don't want you calling me here, and so forth. So things were bad between them. And it looked as if maybe he had come out on Thursday night to make up with Marina because they had quarreled about this. But Oswald asked her, I believe it was 3 times that night, to think about living with him again. He wanted to get an apartment for the two of them, and that, they now had 2 children. The second baby they had was only a month old.
Wow.
Born at Parkland Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And Marina was not ready for that. And she sort of turned him down. And the next morning, when he goes off, before he goes off to the depository, he left his wedding ring in a cup at Ruth's house. And, so yes, this is one of the might have beens about the assassination. If Marina had been in a more conciliatory mood and had, said, I'm ready to make another go of it with you, would things have been different? I mean, she didn't break with him. It wasn't as if she said that she wanted to divorce him or whatever, but she was with a month-old baby. She was in a comfortable suburban house with a washing machine and, the suburban comforts of the early 60s. And it was just a much more sensible situation for her. And so it's hard to know. It's hard to know how much he, took that to heart, and if he would have aborted, this murderous mission that he had her answers been different. And I guess there's really no way to answer that.
It's intriguing to contemplate, though. Sort of a final question, Tom. I want to urge anyone who's watching this to pay attention to the work of Thomas Mallon. It's an incredible body of work. I recommend not only Mrs. Payne's Garage, but all of his other books, Landfall, Henry and Clara, all of the other ones. It's fascinating. The arc of your career is extraordinary, and I feel that I've learned so much reading these books. So I guess the final question would be, what have 20 years later, basically, what have we learned? What have you learned about this event, about Ruth Paine, in the 20 years since this book came out?
Well, before I answer that, let me thank you for being so kind. You've been so kind to my work for so many years. I appreciate your support of it tremendously. As for 20 years, I would say that really knowing Ruth as a person now for more than 20 years. I mean, I met her 25 years ago, I think. We met in 96. Knowing her as a person, as we worked on the book, when the book came out, the difficulties she had when it came out, because it had stirred up all of this in her. And I saw how difficult that was for her, and we didn't absolutely agree on everything, although anybody who reads the book knows that, as one reviewer said, it gives us sort of the one bright kind of shining figure in the assassination. There are a lot of, as I don't need to tell you, a lot of really grubby characters on the fringes of this, and she's sort of the opposite of all that. But everything I have known about her as a person, every encounter I've had with her over the last couple of decades, all of everything from emails to phone calls to visits, whenever we've seen each other, everything has confirmed my view of the kind of person she was in 1963, that she was the kind of person who would do those kindnesses to this young couple. And she is the kind of person who told the truth. She told the truth to the Warren Commission. She told the truth to writers about the assassination. She told the truth to me. And I think that she has lived that. And I think that one of the things that I think is very, just to end this by talking about what you said about conspiracy theories and how we're awash in them, not just over the Kennedy assassination, but over so many things. I think that one of the reasons that they are able to flourish as much is that we have less of a regard now for the literal truth of anything than we used to. There's one phrase I absolutely cannot stand in the culture, and it's used by many people in many situations where they'll say, well, that's my truth. Yeah. That's my truth.
Right.
And the truth does not belong to any individual. It doesn't belong to any political party. It doesn't belong to anybody. It is a fixed thing. There are ways things happened or didn't happen. And you can't say, well, that's my truth. And the way I think the assassination happened is, it's the way I believe it happened, and therefore that's my truth. No, I mean, I'm I'm not saying that Oswald did this by himself because that's my truth. I'm saying because that's what I believe the facts say. And I invite anybody to investigate the facts. That's the only way you can get at the truth. And this is what I believe is the truth. Other people don't. If they don't, they're obligated, like any good newspaperman, to follow the facts. But the subjectivity is killing us in many ways in this country. And the idea that you can simply fasten on a truth, proclaim it as your own, and then say it has the same status as what we used to think of as objective truth. How on earth do you serve on a jury if that's the way you regard the truth, if you regard it as something you can personally craft? So in that sense, I think the whole story of contention over the Kennedy assassination, contention over what happened, I think in many respects, it does remain a very relevant story.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for doing this, Mike. Good to see you, even virtually.
Good to see
Thank
you.
you both so much. That was absolutely fascinating. It was a real treat to listen to your conversation. So thank you very much. I'll mention really briefly that Mrs. Payne's Garage is available in the museum store, either in person or online at store.jfk.org. And of course, members get a discount on purchases. So we certainly hope that, that you'll check that out there. But again, thank you both so much for your time and for spending this time with us. It was a really fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Kim.
Thanks very much, Kim.